All right, today we're stepping onto a medical battlefield. This is a place where the body's most crucial protectors, the ones guarding our very consciousness, come under direct attack. We're talking about a siege on the brain's last line of defense, meningitis. So, think about this for a second. We all know the skull, right? It's our brain's helmet, this super tough fortress against, getting knocked on the head. But what happens when the threat isn't a fist or a fall? What happens when it's a microscopic invader? What protects the protectors that are inside that fortress? Well, that's where the unsung heroes of our neurological defense system come in, the meninges. Think of them as this multi-layered shield working totally behind the scenes. But what happens when that shield is breached? What happens when it becomes the very center of the conflict? That's exactly when we get meningitis. We're talking about the acute inflammation of these very protective membranes. And look, this isn't just some infection you can wait out. It is a full-blown, life-threatening emergency where literally every single second counts.
Okay, so to really get what's happening here, we need to understand the layout of the fortress, right? We need to meet the defenders. And in anatomy, they're actually known affectionately as the mothers. So if you could peek inside, right between the hard bone of your skull and the super delicate tissue of the brain, that's where you'd find these three distinct layers. And they are not just filler material. No way. They're a really sophisticated, multi-layered defense system.
Let's break them down, starting from the outside and working our way in. First up, you've got the dura mater. It's Latin for tough mother. And believe me, it lives up to the name. It's this thick, really unyielding outer guard. Then, underneath that, you have the arachnoid mater, which sounds like arachnid for a reason. It's got this cool spiderweb-like appearance. And finally, hugging the brain itself is the pia mater, which is like a soft, delicate blanket. Now, right in between that spiderweb layer and the soft blanket layer, that's the critical battlefield. It's called the subarachnoid space, and it's filled with this life-sustaining liquid, the cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. Now, this fluid is amazing. It nourishes the brain, it cushions it. But here's the catch. It's also the perfect place for invading bacteria to thrive, turning this protective river into an absolute war zone. So how does this siege even begin? I mean, how do these tiny, microscopic invaders manage to breach all those fortress walls and get to that critical inner space? Well, it usually starts with an infection somewhere else in the body, maybe your ears or sinuses. From there, bacteria can sneak into the bloodstream. And then, somehow they manage to cross this incredibly selective checkpoint called the blood-brain barrier. Once they're inside, it's like they've hit the jackpot. They find that nutrient-rich CSF and just start multiplying like crazy. This, of course, triggers a massive inflammatory response from the body, which leads to swelling of the brain and a really dangerous increase in pressure inside that sealed-off skull. Now, here's something you absolutely have to know. Not all invaders are created equal. You have viral meningitis, which is actually way more common and thankfully usually a lot milder. But bacterial meningitis? Whoa, that is a different beast entirely. It's a code red, get to the hospital now kind of medical emergency. It can cause permanent damage or even death in a matter of hours. And while meningitis can really strike anyone at any age, it wages a particularly devastating war on the most vulnerable among us, those with the least developed defenses, newborns. So let's focus in on that neonatal connection for a minute. See, for newborns, the usual suspects are a bit different. The biggest threats are bacteria like root B strep, E. coli, and listeria. And here's the really tough part. A baby doesn't usually get these from the outside world. They're typically acquired from the mother, right during the process of labor and delivery. And that brings us to the key risk factors. A big one is if the mother has an untreated GBS infection herself. Another is the premature rupture of membranes, when the water breaks way too early. That can basically open up a highway for bacteria. And of course, premature babies. Their immune systems are still so underdeveloped, which makes them exceptionally vulnerable. What makes this even harder is that spotting the enemy is completely different in babies. In adults, we look for that classic triad: fever, headache, and a stiff neck. But a baby can't tell you their head hurts, can they? So instead, you have to look for the hallmark signs in an infant. A bulging fontanelle, that's the soft spot on their head, which is bulging from the pressure. A really distinctive, high-pitched cry. And just profound lethargy, being floppy and unresponsive. So when these terrifying signs do appear, what happens next? How does the rescue mission begin? How do doctors diagnose the problem and launch a counterattack fast enough to make a difference? Okay, The one definitive test, the absolute gold standard, is a lumbar puncture, what most of us call a spinal tap. This is where a needle is carefully inserted into the lower back, right into that space that contains the cerebrospinal fluid. It's the only way to get a sample from the actual battlefield itself, so we can analyze it and see exactly what's going on. And a huge, critical part of this procedure falls to the nursing staff. It is their job to get the patient positioned perfectly, especially a tiny newborn. They have to hold the baby gently but firmly in a C shape. This opens up the space between the vertebrae and makes sure the whole procedure is as safe and successful as possible. It's a huge responsibility. Once meningitis is confirmed, the medical arsenal gets deployed, and fast. For bacterial cases, that means high-dose IV antibiotics started immediately. Then you've got drugs like mannitol or corticosteroids to fight that incredibly dangerous swelling in the brain. And of course, for specific viral causes, antivirals are brought in. But the nursing counterattack is every bit as vital. We're talking about initiating droplet precautions right away to stop any spread, performing neurological checks constantly, sometimes every hour, and creating a low-stimulus environment, basically a dark, quiet room. Why? Because a patient with an inflamed brain is at an extremely high risk for seizures, so you have to protect them from any extra stimulation. So, with fast, decisive action, the battle can often be won. But that leaves us with one final and maybe the most crucial question of all. In a fight this devastating, how do we prevent the war from ever even starting? And it turns out there's a really powerful answer to that. One of the single most effective preventative measures we have is routine screening for Group B strep in expectant mothers, usually between 36 and 37 weeks. Because by simply identifying and treating mothers who carry the bacteria, we can stop this terrible siege on newborns before it ever has a chance to begin.